Hello, my name is Liz Walker, and for my final presentation, I decided to do Chinese adoptees and how they have had to suffer with an identity crisis. So, for my introduction, Chinese adoptees have felt an identity crisis sometime in their life and it has shaped their views regarding themselves and the world around them. The population I decided to do for my presentation are the Asian Americans. The reason for me choosing the Asian American population is because I can personally relate to this group. I was adopted from China when I was almost 2 years old. I grew up in a predominantly white community. I did not know much about my culture and have had a personal identity crisis partially because of this. I always felt I was never able to fit in. I was either too white for the Asian community or too Asian for the white community. I faced bullying and was often taunted. This helped me realize to not take anything negative someone says to me personally. I grew, you could almost say, immune to the jokes and stereotypes. I learned that these remarks were based on bigotry and ignorance. By writing my discussion on Asian Americans, I will gain knowledge about my ethnic background and become more secure and confident at being part of the Asian American community. My main interests in this community gear towards Chinese adoptees. I want to know if Chinese adoptees have felt an identity crisis sometime in their life and how it has shaped their views regarding themselves and the world around them. In regards to is public policy present, the answer is yes. Public policy has made it so there is already an image created for Chinese adoptees. People often associate the Asian community with various stigmas and negative jokes about their cultural background. The issue has to do with people not being properly educated when discussing racial topics, as well as normalizing these assumptions and believing these assumptions are true. The world creates a false and negative image of things that are unknown to them, just to feel more secure about the subject at hand, when in fact these are just incorrect assumptions and do more harm than good. By doing this presentation, I am hoping to be able to address multiple current problems the Asian community has to endure due to the lack of knowledge the rest of the world lacks, and hoping to change other perspectives on the Asian population by educating them. So, like I said before, my main objective is how Chinese adoptees have experienced an identity crisis and how it has shaped their perspective on the world as well as themselves. I decided to interview my friend Sophie, who's also a Chinese adoptee, and asked her multiple questions to gain knowledge about her personal experiences and how it has influenced her perspective on life. The next 5 slides will consist of questions I asked Sophie to understand her life and to hopefully have her experiences influence others in a manner that will teach them the struggles that adoptees face. This hopefully will educate people so they know that the assumptions and stigmas they often make negatively impact the Asian community and can create a lifelong identity crisis. Before I continue to the question slides, I would like to first give some brief knowledge about Chinese adoption. In the article, For Chinese American Adoptees, Matters of Identity by Ella Taylor, she explains, and I quote, of the roughly 80,000 Chinese children adopted in the United States since 1979 are almost all girls, abandoned at birth by their parents because of China's one-child policy. You see, baby girls are often not as wanted compared to baby boys, since baby boys continue the family's last name. So this means there are much more abandoned girls than there are boys. End quote. Now we will move on to the questions. The first question I asked Sophie was, have you ever experienced an identity crisis growing up in America? Do you still experience an identity crisis? Sophie said she has and still is experiencing an identity crisis. She first noticed her disassociation with her identity as she grew older. She often felt she was too Asian to be part of the white community or too white to be part of the Asian community, much of the same feelings that I have felt. This created the feeling of being in the middle of two sides and never felt like she belonged to a community. These feelings are still an ongoing occurrence for her, to the point where she feels like an imposter, and she still is unsure who she is and where she truly belongs. In the article, For Chinese Adoptees in the U.S., Identity Comes in Layers, written by Don Wu, he explains, and I quote, most of these children grow up in white communities and are raised by white families. As such, they see themselves subconsciously as white and often experience identity crisis because they do not look like the people around them. End quote. Chinese adoptees tend to be more cultural whitewashed due to being in an environment of Western culture. We feel it's much easier to change ourselves and be accepted by society than to try and change society. Question 2. I asked Sophie, do you feel your feelings would be different if you were raised by a different race/ethnic family/community? She explained she feels her perspective on the identity crisis would only be different if she were raised by a Chinese family or community. The disconnection of identity would decrease, and she would feel more rooted within her own identity, since she would be able to learn to understand her culture and heritage. By having her environment being more integrated with her origin of birth, it would allow for her to navigate her identity. These solutions would not completely fix the divide, but it would resolve the feeling of feeling like an imposter. The third question I asked Sophie was, how has your adopted family engaged and involved you in regards to your Chinese culture? Sophie discussed that she has had to take the first initial step in regards to being engaged in her Chinese culture. She started by taking Chinese language classes in high school for 4 years. The thought of talking to her family about becoming more connected with her heritage did not really cross her mind, since she truly did not feel Chinese. Looking back on it, she does regret she did not reach out to her family, since they could have helped her through a lot with her identity crisis. She also had the fear that asking questions to her adopted family and about her culture would come across as ungrateful, or that she wishes she had a different life. In the article, Introduction to a Never-Ending Identity Crisis, written by Brianna Clancy, she explains, and I quote, "Many do not have the opportunity to reconnect with their culture until they develop critical thinking skills, gain multicultural exposure, and secure an empathetic support system. We are often reduced to objects, and our ethnic identities are stripped off like a band-aid on an open wound, where white families can praise how lucky we are or exotify our identities, leaving the open wound still unhealed." End quote. This quote just further explains how Sophie has felt, and the reason why Sophie has felt that way, because often culture gets buried due to being westernized when you are adopted. My next question was, what has been the hardest struggles you have experienced relating to being adopted internationally? The hardest struggle Sophie has experienced was how she perceived herself in the past and currently. When she was younger, she viewed being Chinese as being special and a positive characteristic of herself. As she grew older, though, her perspective on herself changed and later turned into more of a curse. It was in kindergarten where she first experienced an identity crisis. One of her classmates asked her, "Who are your true parents?" implying that her adopted parents were not really her true parents, since they were not her biological parents. Unsure how to answer this question that her classmate asked her, she said her adopted parents were her true parents. Her classmate was not satisfied with this answer and continued to ask the same questions. Later that day, after school, Sophie went to her oldest sister and asked her who her real parents were. Her sister became very angry by this question and proceeded to lecture, explaining her that her adopted parents were her true parents. This reaction made it so Sophie was too scared to ever approach the subject to her family ever again. My last question I asked was, what has impacted your perspective on life the most? The main influence that impacted Sophie as a Chinese adoptee the most was the media, specifically TV shows and movies. Due to the fact that a lot of the main influences on media are Caucasian, it created a general norm of how one should look and what the beauty standards should look like. Standing out was a main concern for Sophie because she viewed herself as foreign. This caused a feeling of being out of place to occur, and it is still an everyday occurrence. She felt that there was nowhere she belonged and did not know how to explore her feelings towards herself, since there was lack of representation of the Asian community. Now, I will further explain my personal experiences that I have had. So, as I said before, my name is Liz Walker. I am a Chinese/Vietnamese American. I'm adopted from Guangzhou, Guangdong, China when I was 22 months. My Chinese name is Mei Ying. I am 20 years old and my pronouns are she, her. I wanted to do a brief explanation of the experiences that I have felt being adopted into a transracial family. Growing up, my family and I never really had the "you're adopted" conversation. It was just something that I always knew. I knew I was different from my family, but it never really bothered me until I started kindergarten. I would often get the questions, "Where are you from? Who are you? And who are your real parents? Why do you not look like your parents? Why are your eyes small?" And many other different variations of the same questions. Getting asked these questions at such a young age takes a major toll on a person. I started to question who I was, where I truly belonged. Just like my interviewee, Sophie, I felt like I was too white for the Asian community or too Asian for the white community. Going into middle school, I became almost immune to all the negative remarks and stereotypes people would often say to me since I grew up listening to the same things over and over again. It was when I reached 8th or ninth grade that I began to experience new comments. These comments shifted from backhanded compliments to flirting, and boys/men such as calling me exotic, and that I was quite beautiful for being Chinese. It seemed like they viewed these comments as a compliment, and that I should be grateful for what they were saying to me, when in reality, they were fetishizing and merely making remarks on my physical appearance. It disgusted and repulsed me. Just like before, I grew to become immune to these nasty statements. In high school is where I felt my identity crisis took its peak. I felt like I was either a walking stereotype or just a walking figure that boys/men viewed as an object for their sexual gratification. But now that I am in college, I have learned and realized that these comments and assumptions are based on ignorance and bigotry. I changed my perspective and my way of thinking from "what is wrong with me?" and "I need to change myself" to "that is their problem, and I cannot change their opinion of me, so I should not let it control who I am, and what they say does not define me." There will still be instances where I do question who I am, but I do know that I am Liz Walker, and I am proud to be a Chinese adoptee. My thoughts after conducting this interview was a mixture of not being surprised with the answers, as well as what can the world do better to avoid these negative feelings many transracial adoptees face. I learned that I am not the only Chinese adoptee to have these same exact feelings and experiences. This interview created some relief to me that I am not alone and that others have experienced either the same or similar situations. And as adoptees, it should be our goal to educate people more about our experiences so they hopefully understand that the things they say do affect us, and that they can instead of believing assumptions and stereotypes, they can be educated and realize that the things they say or think does affect us negatively. Thank you. And then these are my references.